An abused maid was reborn as the billionaire's lover. And then this happened. She spent years scrubbing floors for people who treated her like dirt, until one cruel night they threw her out into the snow to die. But when her heart stopped, something divine happened. She came back. Reborn? Different, stronger. Now the same woman the world stepped on walks into the mansion of a lonely billionaire, and without realizing it, changes his life forever. But when she sings a lullaby that only his dead wife used to know, everything stops. Who is she really? How does she know the song that was never meant to be heard again? And when love rises between them, and the world tries to tear it apart, can a broken maid and a broken man find redemption in each other, or will the truth destroy them both? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The marble floors gleamed like ice under Faith Daniel's knees as she scrubbed in slow, methodical circles. Her weathered hands, cracked from harsh cleaning chemicals, moved with practiced precision across the expensive stone. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Warren family's Manhattan penthouse, snow fell in thick, silent flakes, coating the city in white. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Faith hummed softly, the familiar hymn warming her spirit like a cup of hot tea on a cold morning. It was her mother's favorite, sung countless times on their small front porch back in Alabama. The memory of Mama's voice, sweet and strong, helped Faith endure another long day of cutting remarks and demanding tasks. Mrs. Warren's heels clicked sharply across the freshly cleaned floor, leaving faint marks that Faith would need to polish away later. "Faith, I expect the entire East Wing spotless before the dinner party tonight. And do try to make yourself scarce when the guests arrive. We wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable." "Yes, Mom," Faith replied quietly, keeping her eyes lowered. 39 years old, and still being treated like she was invisible. Or worse, like she was something unpleasant that needed to be hidden away. When the sun dipped below the city skyline, Faith's knees ached fiercely from hours of scrubbing. She yearned for her small apartment, where a worn sketchbook waited beneath her mattress. In its pages, elegant dresses bloomed like flowers, designs she'd dreamed up while folding endless loads of designer clothing. She'd learned to sew at her mama's knee, and even now, her fingers itched to create something beautiful, instead of just maintaining someone else's beauty. The dinner party was in full swing when Mrs. Warren's shrill voice cut through the evening's polite chatter. "My necklace! My diamond necklace is gone!" Faith's heart dropped to her stomach as Mrs. Warren burst into the kitchen, where she was quietly washing dishes. The woman's face was flushed, with anger, her perfectly manicured finger pointing accusingly. You were the only one in my bedroom today." "Mrs. Warren, Faith started, but the words stuck in her throat as other party guests filtered in, their faces a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Don't you dare lie to me," Mrs. Warren hissed. "That necklace was worth more than you'll make in 10 years. Where is it?" Faith's hands trembled as she dried them on her apron. "Mom, I would never steal from you. I was only doing my regular cleaning." "Search her things," Mr. Warren commanded, his voice cold and dismissive. "Call security." The next few minutes passed in a horrible blur. Faith stood, humiliated, as security guards roughly went through her small bag. Her worn Bible, her mother's Bible, was dumped onto the counter, its pages falling open to reveal the pressed flower she kept there. Her coat pockets were turned inside out. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Nothing here, sir," one guard reported. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. Mrs. Warren's face was twisted with contempt as she spat out, "Get out! You're fired! And don't expect a reference, or your last paycheck." "Please," Faith whispered, thinking of her rent due next week. "I've worked for you for 3 years. I would never—" "Out!" Mrs. Warren screamed, making several guests jump. "Before I call the police!" Faith's hands shook as she gathered her Bible and coat. The party guests parted like water as she walked through them, some turning their faces away, others watching with poorly concealed fascination at the evening's entertainment. The service elevator felt like a cage as it carried her down 60 floors to the lobby. Outside, the snow had turned into a full blizzard. Wind whipped at Faith's inadequate coat as she clutched her Bible to her chest. She had exactly $7.23 in her purse, not even enough for a taxi. The subway station was 6 blocks away. "Lord," she whispered, her words carried away by the howling wind. "I don't understand. I've always tried to do right, to be good, to keep faith." But the prayer felt hollow, like it was bouncing off the heavy grey sky and falling back to earth, unanswered. Faith pulled her coat tighter and began walking. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the Warren family's accusations was physically pressing her down. The few people still on the street hurried past, heads bent against the storm, no one noticing the woman whose world had just shattered. The hymn came back to her, unbidden, her mother's voice a ghost in her memory. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come." But for the first time in her life, Faith wasn't sure grace would be enough to see her through. The wind howled louder, drowning out even her thoughts. Snow collected on her eyelashes and melted down her cheeks, mixing with the tears she finally allowed to fall. Her feet, numb in their thin shoes, carried her forward automatically, while her mind spun with terrifying questions. How would she pay rent? Who would hire her without a reference? How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? The Bible she clutched was getting damp from the snow, its well-worn pages, her mother's legacy of faith, threatening to warp in the wetness. Faith tucked it deeper inside her coat, protecting it as best she could. It was all she had left now, that and the dreams hidden in her sketchbook, which suddenly seemed more impossible than ever. A passing car splashed through a slush puddle, soaking her legs to the knee. Faith barely felt it through the numbness that had settled over her body and soul. The bright lights of Manhattan continued to shine through the snowstorm, but they no longer seemed magical. Instead, they were cold and distant, like stars viewing human suffering with complete indifference. "I have already come," she whispered again. But the words felt like ash in her mouth. How many more dangers, toils, and snares could one person endure? The Warren family's casual cruelty had taken more than just her job. They'd stolen her dignity, her security, and worst of all, they'd shaken her faith in the goodness she'd always tried to believe in. The snow continued to fall, erasing her footprints almost as soon as she made them, as if the city itself was trying to erase any evidence that Faith Daniels had ever walked its streets with hope in her heart. Each step forward was a battle against the wind, against despair, against the voice in her head that wondered if Mrs. Warren was right, if she really was worth nothing more than the dirt she'd spent her days cleaning from other people's floors. The biting wind cut through Faith's thin coat like knives. Her legs, numb from the cold and exhaustion, finally gave out beneath her. She stumbled, her knees hitting the icy sidewalk hard. Through snow-crusted eyelashes, she made out the dim shape of a small church, its stained glass windows glowing warmly in the storm. "Just need to rest," she mumbled, her words slurring. The Bible slipped from her frozen fingers as she slumped against a lamppost. The snow didn't feel so cold anymore. In fact, she felt almost warm, which some distant part of her mind knew wasn't good. The world began to blur at the edges, dark spots dancing in her vision. Was this how it would end? On a frozen street corner, alone and discarded? Faith's eyes drifted closed as consciousness began to slip away. Through the haze, she heard a door bang open and hurried footsteps crunching through the snow. A man's voice called out, "Miss, miss, can you hear me?" Warm hands touched her face, and Faith forced her heavy eyelids open. A young man in a minister's collar knelt before her, his face etched with concern. Behind him stood a woman in scrubs, already on her phone. "I'm calling an ambulance," the nurse said urgently. "She's severely hypothermic." "Stay with us," the minister urged, shrugging off his coat and wrapping it around Faith's shoulders. "I'm Reverend Harper. You're safe now." Faith tried to respond, but her tongue felt too thick in her mouth. The world tilted sideways as strong arms lifted her. Through the fog of semi-consciousness, she was aware of being carried into warmth, of voices speaking urgently over her head, of sirens wailing in the distance. The ambulance ride was a blur of motion and voices. Faith caught fragments of conversation. Body temperature dangerously low, possible cardiac complications, need to warm her gradually. The hospital emergency room blazed with harsh fluorescent lights. Faith watched as if from a great distance as doctors and nurses swarmed around her. Someone was cutting away her wet clothes. Another person was inserting an IV. The medical team's voices seemed to come from very far away. Blood pressure dropping. Core temperature still too low. "She's crashing!" Pain shot through Faith's chest, sharp, crushing pressure that stole her breath. The monitor beside her bed began screaming as darkness closed in. And then, peace. Faith found herself standing in a vast field of pure, golden light. The pain was gone. The cold was gone. In fact, all physical sensation seemed to have vanished. She felt weightless, suspended in this brilliant radiance that somehow didn't hurt her eyes. The light seemed alive, warming her, embracing her, filling her with indescribable peace. Faith had never felt such complete acceptance, such perfect love. Then came the voice, neither male nor female, neither loud nor soft, but resonating through her very being. "It isn't over, my child. You were made for more." The words filled her with certainty, with purpose, with a deep knowing that transcended understanding. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. "Made for more," Faith whispered into the light. "Time to go back now," the voice said gently. "Remember, you carry this light within you." The golden radiance began to fade, replaced by harsh hospital lighting and the beeping of monitors. Faith's eyes fluttered open to find several relieved faces looking down at her. "Welcome back," said a doctor, checking her vitals. "You gave us quite a scare there." Faith's body felt weak, but her spirit felt stronger than it had in years. The memory of that light, that voice, filled her with quiet certainty. God hadn't abandoned her. He'd given her a second chance. The next morning, Faith was sitting up in bed, watching dawn paint the sky in gentle pinks and golds when there was a knock at her door. Reverend Harper entered, carrying a small bouquet of cheerful daisies. "I thought these might brighten your room," he said, placing them on her bedside table. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Faith replied. "Thank you for finding me, for helping me. God put you on our doorstep for a reason," Reverend Harper said simply. He hesitated, then continued. "I know you've been through a terrible ordeal, and I don't want to pry, but I want you to know that our church has a small guest house. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and safe. You'd be welcome to stay there while you recover and get back on your feet." Faith looked at him in surprise. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" The young minister smiled. "Because we're not strangers, we're family in Christ, and family helps each other." Tears welled in Faith's eyes as she looked out the window at the brightening sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and new, like her heart, like her spirit. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for letting me start again." She turned back to Reverend Harper. "I would be very grateful for that offer." He nodded, his expression gentle. "Rest now. We'll take care of all the details when you're stronger." As he left, Faith settled back against her pillows, holding the memory of that golden light close to her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew with unshakable certainty that she was no longer walking alone. The morning sun streamed through her window, warming her face like a benediction. Outside, the city was coming alive with the promise of a new day, and for the first time in years, Faith felt truly awake to that promise, truly alive to the possibility that she was, indeed, made for more. The morning sunlight streamed through the church's stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews as Faith ran her dust cloth along them. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood filled her nostrils as she worked, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of cleaning. But this was different from her days at the Warrens' penthouse. Here, she worked with dignity, not desperation. "You don't have to do this, you know," Reverend Harper said, pausing in the doorway. "You're our guest, not our janitor." Faith smiled, continuing her methodical cleaning. "It helps me feel useful. Besides, this is God's house. It deserves to shine." Every morning, she joined Reverend Harper for prayers, her voice growing stronger as she sang the old hymns she'd known since childhood. The quiet moments in the chapel became anchors in her day, reminding her of that golden light she'd seen during her near-death experience. In the afternoons, Faith helped at the church's soup kitchen. She learned every regular's name, remembered their stories, and always had an encouraging word ready. Some of them had been executives once, others had never known anything but hardship. But Faith treated them all with the same gentle respect. "You've got a gift," Mrs. Martinez, another volunteer, told her one day as they stirred enormous pots of soup. "You make people feel seen." Faith just smiled, ladling out portions with care. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. 3 weeks into her stay, Reverend Harper approached her after morning prayers. "I'd like you to meet someone," he said, leading her down the street to a cheerful little cafe with window boxes full of bright flowers. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. The cafe was warm and inviting, with mismatched furniture that somehow worked perfectly together. The aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air. "Mrs. Greer?" Reverend Harper called out. "I brought that friend I told you about." A sturdy woman in her 50s emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. She had steel-grey hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, but her eyes were kind despite her sharp gaze. "So, you're Faith," Mrs. Greer said, looking her up and down. "Caleb here says you need work, and I need help. My last waitress left to go to college. Good for her, hard on me." "I'd be grateful for any opportunity," Faith replied steadily, meeting the older woman's evaluating look. Mrs. Greer's expression softened slightly. "Can you start tomorrow? 6 a.m. sharp." And just like that, Faith found herself with a job. The work was honest and sometimes exhausting, but Mrs. Greer was fair. She taught Faith how to operate the expensive coffee machine, showed her the proper way to plate the cafe's famous pastries, and never criticized without also showing how to improve. The regulars quickly warmed to Faith. There was Mr. Peterson, who came in every morning for black coffee and the daily paper. Miss Chen from the flower shop next door, who traded fresh bouquets for muffins. The group of nurses from the nearby hospital, dragging themselves in after night shifts. "You're good for business," Mrs. Greer commented one afternoon, watching Faith chat easily with customers. "People come in grumpy and leave smiling." Faith was wiping down tables one chilly afternoon when the bell chimed. She looked up to see a man enter, tall, imposing in an expertly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than she'd earn in a year. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his features striking, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were a deep brown, but held such sadness it made her heart ache. He strode to the counter, phone pressed to his ear. "No, tell Stevens the meeting's been moved up. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Yes, I know about the Shanghai deal. Just handle it." He ended the call with a sharp tap, then focused on the menu board as if it were a hostile takeover proposal. "Welcome to Greer's," Faith said warmly. "What can I get for you today?" He barely glanced at her. "Large coffee, black." Faith moved to prepare his drink, maintaining her calm demeanor despite his brusqueness. She'd dealt with enough wealthy people to recognize the armor of superiority they often wore. $4.50, she said, setting his coffee on the counter. He handed her a $20 bill, already reaching for his phone again. Faith counted out his change carefully, making sure to look him in the eye as she handed it back. "Thank you for coming in. Have a blessed day." Something in her voice, or perhaps her steady gaze, made him pause. For a moment, his carefully constructed facade cracked, and she glimpsed such raw pain beneath that it took her breath away. Their eyes held for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then he took his coffee and turned away, but at the door he hesitated. Looking back over his shoulder, his expression was different, slightly softer, slightly less certain. Faith offered a gentle smile, and something flickered in those haunted eyes before he disappeared into the afternoon crowd. "That was Ethan Sinclair," Mrs. Greer said, emerging from the kitchen. "Billionaire businessman, lost his wife and unborn child 5 years ago in a car accident. Never been the same since, they say." Faith watched through the window as his tall figure vanished among the other pedestrians. "Sometimes the richest people are the poorest in spirit," she murmured, remembering the emptiness she'd seen in his eyes. "Speaking of spirit," Mrs. Greer said briskly, "those tables won't wipe themselves." Faith picked up her cloth again, but her thoughts kept returning to that moment of connection. She said a quick prayer for the man with the sad eyes, asking God to ease whatever burden weighed so heavily on his heart. The afternoon continued, filled with the comfortable routine of serving customers, brewing coffee, and keeping the cafe spotless. But something had shifted, like the first hint of spring after a long winter. Faith didn't know it yet, but that brief encounter would prove to be the beginning of something neither she nor Ethan Sinclair could have anticipated. The morning sunlight streamed through the cafe windows, catching dust motes in its golden beams. Faith hummed softly as she arranged fresh muffins in the display case, her movements gentle and precise. A week had passed since the mysterious Mr. Sinclair's visit, and though she hadn't expected to see him again, something told her their paths would cross once more. As if summoned by her thoughts, the bell chimed. There he stood, looking less rushed today, but no less burdened. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, but dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair," Faith said warmly. "Black coffee again?" He blinked, surprised she remembered. "Yes, please." His voice was quieter today, lacking the sharp edge of his previous visit. The cafe was empty except for them, the morning rush having ended. As Faith prepared his coffee, she noticed him sink into a nearby chair, shoulders slumping slightly when he thought no one was watching. "Rough morning?" she asked softly, placing his coffee before him. He looked up, studying her face as if searching for something. "Rough few years, actually." The words seemed to surprise him as much as her. Faith settled into the chair across from him, sensing he needed someone to listen. Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter. Ethan wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "It's my mother," he said finally. She's bedridden now, has been for months. The best medical care money can buy, but—" He trailed off, staring into his coffee. "She's lonely." Faith finished gently. "Yes." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "The nurses are professional but cold. They treat her like a task to be completed, not a person. And I—" His jaw tightened. "I'm barely there. Always another meeting, another deal." "You're doing your best," Faith said, her voice carrying that same grace that had caught his attention before. "Am I?" He laughed bitterly. "I haven't even been able to find someone who can truly care for her, someone who might—" He stopped, studying Faith with new intensity. Faith waited, feeling the weight of the moment. "The way you are with people here," he said slowly. "The kindness in your voice, your patience. Would you consider—" He straightened, businessman mode engaging. "I'd like to offer you a position as my mother's caretaker. Full benefits, excellent salary, private quarters in our home." Faith's heart skipped. The offer was unexpected, yet somehow felt like an answer to prayer. Still, memories of her last domestic position made her hesitate. "Mr. Sinclair, I appreciate the offer, but I need to be clear. I won't be treated as a servant of shame." "Never," he said firmly. "You'd be caring for the most precious person in my life. You'd be treated with utmost respect." Faith folded her hands in her lap. "May I have time to pray about it?" Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps respect. "Of course. Take the day to think it over." That evening, Faith knelt beside her bed in the church guest house. "Lord," she whispered, "if this is your path for me, please make it clear." The answer came as a deep sense of peace, a knowing that transcended logic. The next morning, she accepted Ethan's offer. 2 days later, Faith stood before the Sinclair mansion, a small suitcase at her feet. The limestone facade soared upward, magnificent yet somehow lonely. Ethan met her at the door himself, leading her through halls lined with priceless art. "Mother's room is this way," he said, his stride slowing as they approached. "She can be direct, but she has a good heart." The bedroom was spacious and bright, with large windows overlooking a garden. In the center, propped up on pillows, sat Margaret Sinclair. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her nightgown elegant, but it was her eyes that caught Faith's attention, sharp, intelligent, and kind. "So you're the angel my son's been talking about," Margaret said, her voice warm with amusement. "Come closer, dear. Let me see you properly." Faith approached the bed, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. Margaret reached out, taking Faith's hand in both of hers. "Oh yes," she said softly. "You're exactly what we need." "Mother," Ethan warned, but Margaret waved him off. "Hush, Ethan. I know quality when I see it." She smiled at Faith. "You're not just here to be my nurse, are you? You're here because God sent you." Faith felt tears prick her eyes. "I believe he did, Mrs. Sinclair." "Margaret, please. And you must be the daughter I never had." She patted the bed beside her. "Now sit and tell me everything about yourself while my son pretends he's not eavesdropping by the door." Ethan cleared his throat. "I have meetings." "Of course you do," Margaret said fondly. "Go on then. Faith and I will be fine." The day passed in a gentle rhythm of conversation and care. Faith helped Margaret with her exercises, read to her, and listened to stories about Ethan as a boy. By evening, they felt like old friends. As Faith tucked Margaret into bed that night, the older woman caught her hand again. "Thank you," she whispered, "for treating me like a person, not a patient. You are a precious child of God." Faith replied simply, "Just like me." Later, standing in her new room, spacious and comfortable, with a small sitting area and a view of the garden, Faith felt the weight of divine purpose settle in her heart. This wasn't just a job. It was a calling. She knelt beside her bed, just as she had in the church guest house. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for showing me where I'm needed. Help me be your hands and heart in this place." Outside her window, the stars twinkled like promises in the vast New York sky, and for the first time in years, Faith felt truly, completely at home. Spring sunshine filtered through windows that hadn't seen light in years. Faith stood on tiptoe, pulling back heavy velvet curtains that had kept the Sinclair mansion in perpetual twilight. Dust motes danced in the golden beams, and she smiled, remembering her mama's words. "Let the light in, baby. Everything grows better in God's sunshine." The house seemed to exhale as fresh air swept through opened windows. In the kitchen, Faith hummed while stirring a pot of chicken and dumplings, the recipe passed down through generations in Alabama. The aroma drew Margaret from her bedroom for the first time in weeks. "What heavenly smell is that?" Margaret asked, gripping her walker. "Just a little something from home," Faith replied, helping her to a kitchen chair. "I thought we could use some comfort food." Day by day, the mansion's atmosphere shifted. Where silence had ruled, now gentle conversation and occasional laughter echoed. Faith brought fresh flowers from the garden, placing them in forgotten vases. She read to Margaret in the afternoons, their voices mixing with bird song through open windows. Ethan noticed the changes, too. He found himself lingering over breakfast, listening to Faith and his mother discuss books or share stories. The weight that had pressed on his chest for years felt slightly lighter. One evening, while Margaret rested, Faith moved through the quiet halls with her cleaning basket. The work wasn't part of her duties, but she couldn't help herself. Caring for spaces was in her nature. As she dusted the library shelves, a familiar melody rose from her heart, and she began to sing softly. "Sleep, my child, in heaven's arms, where angels keep you safe from harm. God's love shines like morning light, guarding you through darkest night." The old gospel lullaby filled the room with its gentle comfort. Faith closed her eyes, swaying slightly as she continued the verse her mama had taught her. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her. Ethan stood in the doorway, frozen. The song pierced through years of carefully constructed walls, striking his heart with devastating accuracy. He gripped the doorframe, memories flooding back. Grace singing that same lullaby, her hand on her swollen belly. Hope still bright in her eyes before everything fell apart. "Stop," he whispered hoarsely. Faith turned, startled. In the flickering candlelight from the mantel, she could see his face had gone pale. "That song," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "How do you know that song?" Faith set down her dusting cloth, something clicking into place in her mind. "I learned it from my mama," she said softly. "But I sang it that night, too. The night your wife—" Recognition dawned in his eyes. "What do you mean, that night?" Faith's heart pounded as the memories surfaced. "I was working at Mercy Hospital then, cleaning the maternity ward. They didn't let us speak to the families, but I was there when—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "When your wife was brought in. When the baby—" Ethan staggered slightly, catching himself against a bookshelf. "You were there." "Yes," Faith whispered. "I heard her singing that lullaby through her pain. When things got worse, I prayed in the hallway all night. They wouldn't let me help, but I couldn't leave. I remember asking about a cleaning woman," Ethan said, his voice distant. "Someone said they'd seen someone praying, but when I tried to find out who, they told us never to speak to the families." Faith explained. "To stay invisible. But I've never forgotten that night, or your wife's voice singing that lullaby Ethan sank into a leather armchair, his composure cracking. "Grace," he whispered. She loved that song. Said her grandmother used to sing it, after we lost the baby, after we lost her. I couldn't bear to hear it again. Faith moved closer, her heart aching for his pain. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Sinclair. I didn't know. How could you?" He looked up at her, really seeing her for the first time. "All these years, you were there, a witness to the worst night of my life?" "Yes," Faith said simply. "And every year since, on that date, I light a candle and say a prayer for your wife, your baby, and for you." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and silent. The library seemed suspended in time as past and present merged in the candlelight. She was so brave. Faith continued gently. Even when things got bad, she kept singing, kept loving. I've always thought that kind of love doesn't die. It just changes form. Ethan's shoulders shook as tears finally broke through years of rigid control. Faith stood, quietly, her presence steady and warm, as the man who had everything wept for all he'd lost. "I never got to thank that praying woman," he said finally, wiping his eyes. "I wanted to, needed to. Somehow, knowing someone was praying that night, it helped. God works in mysterious ways." Faith replied softly. "Maybe he knew we'd meet again when the time was right." The snow fell thicker now, blanketing the world outside in pristine white. Inside the library, two souls once separated by invisible walls of class and circumstance stood together, connected by a shared night of sorrow neither had fully healed from. "Would you—" Ethan cleared his throat. "Would you sing it again? The whole song this time?" Faith nodded, and in the candle-lit library she sang the lullaby that bridged past and present, pain and healing, loss and hope. Her voice carried all the tenderness of that long-ago night, all the prayers whispered in dark hallways, all the love that refuses to die. As the last note faded, they sat in silence, watching the snow transform the world outside. Something had shifted between them, a recognition of shared humanity, of wounds carried too long alone, of grace that works in unexpected ways to bring healing when we least expect it. Neither spoke again that night, but they didn't need to. Sometimes the deepest connections form in silence, in the space between memories and moments, in the quiet acceptance of each other's pain and resilience. The snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the vastness of time and space, a lullaby echoed, connecting past and present, binding together two hearts that had once seemed worlds apart. Morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of the Sinclair mansion. Ethan sat in his study, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside him. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like an old film reel. Faith's voice, the lullaby, the flood of memories he'd kept locked away for so long. His fingers traced the edge of an old photograph on his desk. Grace smiled up at him, her eyes bright with hope, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. The image blurred as tears threatened again. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. Faith stood in the doorway, her posture hesitant but dignified. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair. I can come back later if you'd prefer." "No, please." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Come in, Faith, and please call me Ethan." She settled into the chair, smoothing her simple grey dress. The morning light caught the silver threads in her dark hair, reminding him how much time had passed since that terrible night. "I need to know everything," he said quietly, "about what happened after we lost them. I was so lost in grief I never asked questions I should have." Far's hands folded in her lap, her voice gentle but steady. The night was chaos. Everyone running, shouting orders. I stayed as long as I could, praying. But the next day, the head nurse, Mrs. Peterson, she accused me of negligence, said I'd been in the way, that I shouldn't have been on that floor. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not true. I remember asking about you. The praying woman. They told me you'd just stopped showing up for work. They fired me. Faith said simply. No reference, no explanation, just told me to leave and never come back. I tried to explain, but... She shrugged, a gesture that spoke of years of similar injustices. Dear God, Ethan whispered, running a hand over his face. I'm so sorry, Faith. I should have investigated, should have asked more questions. I couldn't function, couldn't think straight for months. You were grieving, Faith said softly. No one expects clear thinking in times like that. But that's no excuse. Your life was upended because I was too wrapped up in my own pain to see what was happening around me. He stood, pacing to the window. I've done that too often, hiding behind my wealth, my grief, letting others handle the messy details of life. People have been hurt because of my negligence. Faith watched him, her expression thoughtful. Maybe that's why God brought us together again, not just to heal old wounds, but to do something good with them. Ethan turned back to her, something stirring in his heart, an idea that had been dormant for too long. The Grace Foundation, he said suddenly. Pardon? For years I've had this idea, a foundation in Grace's name, to help women in crisis, women who've been abused or displaced. But I could never, he swallowed hard, could never bring myself to start it. Too many memories. Faith's eyes lit up with understanding. Those women need more than just money, Mr. Sin Ethan. They need dignity, purpose, a chance to use their gifts. Exactly. He returned to his desk, pulling out a leather portfolio. I want you to help me build it, Faith. Not as a servant or employee, but as a partner. You understand what these women need in a way I never could. Faith's hands trembled slightly. Are you sure? I don't have any experience with charity work or... You have exactly what we need. Compassion, wisdom, and first-hand understanding. And you'd be doing more than just helping with the foundation. Mother adores you. I'd like you to stay on as her companion, not her caretaker. She needs a friend more than a nurse. Faith sat quietly for a moment, her eyes closed in silent prayer. When she opened them, there was a certainty there that touched something in Ethan's soul. Yes, she said simply. I'll help. Over the next few hours, they began to plan. Ethan pulled out fresh paper, and Faith's ideas flowed freely. Job training programs, counseling services, childcare support. Her quiet confidence grew as Ethan took notes, asking questions, building on her suggestions. As afternoon faded into evening, they ordered dinner to the study. Faith spoke about her own experiences, the women she'd met over the years who needed just one chance, one person to believe in them. Ethan listened, really listened, seeing the world through new eyes. We could start with a small group, Faith suggested, spreading out their notes. Maybe 5 or 10 women, help them find their gifts, their purpose. Then they can help others do the same. Ethan nodded, making another note. Like ripples in a pond. Exactly. Faith smiled, and Ethan found himself smiling back. A real smile, one that reached his eyes. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened. The grandfather clock chimed 10 o'clock, startling them both. They had been working for hours, lost in the possibilities of what they could build together. I should check on your mother, Faith said, gathering her notebook. Thank you, Faith, not just for today, but for everything. For being there that night, for praying when I couldn't, for coming back into our lives when we needed you most. Faith paused at the door, her face gentle in the lamplight. Sometimes the hardest paths lead us exactly where we need to be. As she left, Ethan looked down at their plans, pages and pages of hope taking shape. The Grace Foundation would become more than just a memorial to his wife. It would be a new beginning, for him and for countless others. For the first time in years, he felt truly awake, truly present in his own life. The weight of grief still lived in his heart, but now it had purpose. Like coal transformed into diamonds under pressure, pain transformed into possibility. He glanced at Grace's photograph again, and for the first time, the sight didn't bring just pain. There was something else there now, a sense of continuation, of life moving forward while still honoring what was lost. Outside his study window, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the vast night, he felt Grace smiling down on this new chapter beginning to unfold. The weeks flowed like honey, sweet and slow, as Faith's presence transformed the Sinclair mansion from a mere house into a true home. Her touch was everywhere, in the fresh flowers that now graced every windowsill, in the warm scents wafting from the kitchen, and most notably, in the handmade linens she created during quiet evenings. Faith's skilled fingers worked magic with needle and thread, crafting delicate tablecloths embroidered with morning glories and curtains that caught the light just so. Each piece told a story of care and attention, bringing life to rooms that had long felt empty. The staff meetings, once cold and formal affairs, now began with Faith's gentle suggestion of prayer. At first, some shuffled awkwardly, unused to such openness. But her sincerity won them over, and soon these gatherings became moments of genuine connection. "Lord," she would say, her voice soft but carrying to every corner, "guide our hands in service today, and help us remember that every task, no matter how small, can be an act of love." The change in the household was remarkable. Where there had once been strict hierarchies and tension, now there was warmth and cooperation. Even Mrs. Peterson, the stern housekeeper who'd initially viewed Faith with suspicion, found herself smiling more often. But perhaps Faith's most significant impact came in helping Ethan reconnect with his sister, Catherine. The rift between them had grown since Grace's death, fed by misunderstandings and unspoken grief. Faith listened as Ethan spoke of his sister one evening, hearing the pain beneath his words. She tried to help after Grace. He had explained, staring into his coffee. But I pushed her away, kept pushing until she stopped trying. Faith set her teacup down carefully. Sometimes the people who love us most are the hardest to let in when we're hurting. I wouldn't even know how to begin now. Ethan admitted. Begin with hello, Faith suggested simply. Begin with, I miss you. The next day she helped him draft a letter to Catherine. Nothing grand, just honest words about regret and hope. When Catherine responded, her joy practically leaped off the page. Within weeks, she was visiting regularly, bringing her children who filled the mansion with laughter that had been absent far too long. Margaret Sinclair bloomed under Faith's care like a flower finally finding sunlight. No longer confined to her bed, she now spent hours in the garden Faith had helped restore. Together they planted herbs and flowers, Margaret sharing stories of her younger days, while Faith listened with genuine interest. One particularly beautiful afternoon, Ethan stood at his study window, watching them below. Faith was helping his mother arrange flowers they'd just cut, both women laughing at some shared joke. The spring sunlight caught in Faith's natural curls, creating a halo effect that made his breath catch. She wore a simple cotton dress she'd made herself, its sunny yellow perfectly suited to the day. As she threw her head back in laughter at something his mother said, Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a warming of places long cold. His mother looked younger somehow, her face animated as she gestured with her flowers. Faith steadied her with gentle hands, their movements together speaking of trust and affection. This wasn't the formal care of a hired companion. This was the natural flow of love between two people who had found family in each other. Later that evening, as the sky painted itself in sunset colors, Ethan found himself walking Faith to the garden gate as he often did now. The air was sweet with jasmine, and fireflies were just beginning to rise from the grass like earth-bound stars. They walked in comfortable silence until reaching the wrought-iron gate. Faith's hand rested lightly on the metalwork, but she didn't immediately move to leave. The moment felt weighted with something unspoken. "You've brought life back to this place," Ethan said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just to the house or the garden, but to all of us. To me." Faith turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the golden light. "Your mother makes it easy. She has such a beautiful spirit." "It's more than that," Ethan insisted gently. "Being around you, it feels like coming home after years of cold, like finally being able to breathe properly again." Faith's breath caught, and she looked down at her hands. "Ethan, we come from such different worlds. I'm just a simple woman who sees beauty in everything." He interrupted softly. "Who treats everyone with dignity, who brought my sister back to me, who taught me how to pray again." His hand found hers in the gathering dusk, warm and sure. Faith didn't pull away, though her fingers trembled slightly in his grip. The moment stretched between them, delicate as spun glass and just as precious. The evening air held its breath. Somewhere in the garden, a mockingbird began its evening song. Faith's pulse fluttered beneath his fingers like a captured butterfly, and Ethan found himself studying the gentle curves of her face in the fading light. They stood there, connected by joined hands and shared silence, neither willing to break the spell. It felt like standing on the edge of something vast and wonderful, like the first breath of spring after a long winter, or the first ray of sun after an endless storm. A gentle breeze stirred Faith's curls, carrying the scent of the roses she'd planted weeks ago. The same roses that now bloomed where there had only been thorns, much like the hope now blooming in hearts that had forgotten how to dream. 3 months passed like petals falling from summer roses. The Grace Foundation had grown from a dream into reality, with Faith and Ethan working side by side to create something beautiful from the ashes of their shared past. "You have to come to the gala," Ethan insisted one afternoon, his eyes twinkling with excitement as they reviewed donor lists in his study. "It's your vision too, these programs for displaced women, the job training, the shelter renovations. None of it would exist without you." Faith smoothed her simple cotton skirt, uncertainty crossing her face. "I don't know, Ethan. Those fancy parties. That's not my world." "It is now," he said gently. "These women need to hear your story. You give them hope." Faith's fingers traced the edge of her sketchpad where a design had been taking shape over the past weeks. An elegant gown in deep emerald silk. She'd been working on it in secret, not quite admitting to herself why. "I wouldn't even have anything suitable to wear," she protested weakly. Ethan picked up her sketchpad, admiring the flowing lines of the dress. "I think you already have the solution right here. This is beautiful, Faith." She blushed, taking back the pad. "It's just a dream. Then make it real," he encouraged. "I've seen your other work. You have a gift." Over the next weeks, Faith worked late into the nights, carefully cutting and stitching the emerald silk. Each careful stitch felt like a prayer, like she was sewing her past and future together into something new. Margaret often sat with her, offering gentle encouragement and stories about her own mother who had been a seamstress. The night of the gala arrived clear and crisp. Faith stood in her room, hardly recognizing herself in the mirror. The emerald gown flowed like water, highlighting her curves while maintaining elegance. She'd styled her natural curls into a crown of sorts, with a few tendrils framing her face. Simple pearl earrings, a gift from Margaret, completed the look. Her hands trembled as she smoothed the silk. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, touching the small cross at her throat. The ballroom of the luxury hotel took her breath away. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across marble floors, while arrangements of white roses scented the air. As Faith approached the entrance, she heard Ethan's voice from behind her. "Faith." She turned, and the look on his face made her heart skip. He stood frozen, his eyes wide with wonder. The perfectly tailored tuxedo made him even more handsome than usual, but it was the raw emotion in his expression that caught her breath. "You look—" he started, then shook his head, unable to find words. Faith smoothed her skirt nervously. "Is it too much?" "You're perfect," he said simply, extending his arm. "Shall we?" As they entered the ballroom together, whispers rippled through the crowd. Faith felt the stares but held her head high, drawing strength from Ethan's steady presence beside her. She recognized some of New York's wealthiest families, including a few who had once employed her as a maid. But tonight she wasn't here to serve, she was here as an equal. "Everyone's staring," she murmured. "Because you're radiant," Ethan replied, guiding her through the crowd. "And because they've never seen me smile like this." The evening progressed with dinner and speeches from various board members. Then it was time for Faith to address the crowd. Her heart pounded as she approached the podium, but when she looked out at the sea of faces, she saw beyond the diamonds and designer clothes to the hearts that needed touching. 3 years ago, she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I was invisible, one of the many women who clean your homes, care for your children, yet remain unseen. I worked long hours for little pay, endured mistreatment, and lost my sense of worth." The room fell silent, crystal glasses frozen halfway to lips, all eyes fixed on her. "But God had other plans," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Through the kindness of strangers who became family, through second chances and restored faith, I learned that dignity isn't something others can take from you. It's your birthright as a child of God." She spoke of the women she'd met through their outreach work, mothers fleeing abuse, immigrants working 3 jobs, elderly women abandoned and alone. Without naming names or pointing fingers, she helped the wealthy audience see the humanity in those they'd overlooked. "The Grace Foundation isn't just about providing services," she explained. "It's about restoring dignity. Every woman who walks through our doors learns that she has value beyond measure, that her life matters, that she was created for purpose." Ethan watched from the side, his eyes glistening with unshed tears and pride. Faith's voice carried through the ballroom, touching hearts that had grown cold with privilege. "Tonight, as you consider your donations, remember this. You're not just giving money. You're giving hope. You're saying to these women, you matter, you are seen, you are worthy of a second chance." When she finished, the silence held for a moment before erupting into genuine applause. Many of the women were dabbing at their eyes, while their husbands reached for their checkbooks. Later, as the orchestra played softly, Ethan found Faith on the terrace getting some air. The night breeze gently stirred her dress, and starlight caught in her curls. "That was incredible," he said softly. "You moved every heart in that room." Faith smiled, still amazed at how far she'd come. "I just spoke the truth. You did more than that," Ethan said, moving closer. You taught them, taught me, what grace really looks like. It looks like a woman who survived, who kept her gentle heart despite everything, who helps others find their way back to dignity. His hand found hers, warm and steady. I love you, Faith Daniels. I love your strength and your compassion. I love how you've brought light back into our lives. I love watching you bloom into who you were always meant to be. Faith's heart soared even as tears threatened. Ethan, dance with me? He asked softly, leading her back inside. The orchestra was playing something slow and sweet as Ethan drew her into his arms. They moved together under the sparkling chandeliers, lost in their own world. Faith laid her head against his shoulder, feeling truly at peace. Neither noticed the cameras discreetly capturing their intimate moment, nor the dark looks from certain society women who hadn't missed the way New York's most eligible widower looked at his former maid. But for now, wrapped in each other's arms, they were safe in their bubble of joy, swaying to music that seemed to play just for them. The morning after the gala dawned bright and crisp, but dark clouds were gathering. Leonard Huxley sat in his mahogany-lined office, scrolling through photos from the previous night's event. His jaw clenched at the sight of Ethan and Faith dancing, their happiness evident in every frame. "This won't do at all," he muttered, reaching for his phone. With practiced ease, he dialed Martin Drake, a tabloid reporter known for his ruthless exposés. "Martin, I have something that might interest you." Leonard's voice dripped with false concern. "It's about Ethan Sinclair's new companion. Did you know she used to work for the Warrens?" Within hours, the wheels were in motion. Leonard provided the reporter with carefully selected documents, employment records, police reports, and the damning theft accusation from the Warrens. He wove a tale of manipulation and deceit, suggesting Faith had been present during Grace Sinclair's final days, implying connections that didn't exist. Sources say she was obsessed with Mr. Sinclair even then, the first article declared. Questions arise about her role in Grace Sinclair's tragic breakdown. The story spread like wildfire across social media. By afternoon, more anonymous sources had come forward, each adding layers to the fabricated narrative. Security footage from the gala appeared online, showing Faith's speech twisted with malicious captions. "Con artist seduces billionaire." At the Sinclair mansion, Faith was tending to Margaret when her phone began buzzing incessantly. Messages from unknown numbers flooded in, many filled with hate and accusations. She turned it off, hands shaking. "Something wrong, dear?" Margaret asked, noticing Faith's distress. "Just a headache." Faith lied, forcing a smile. But as the day wore on, she couldn't hide from the growing storm. Reporters gathered at the mansion gates, their cameras flashing like lightning. Inside, Ethan's advisors called an emergency meeting. "This is a PR nightmare," Howard Jensen, the head of communications, declared. "The stock is already dropping. We need to distance ourselves immediately." Ethan sat at his desk, looking stunned. "These accusations are ridiculous. Faith would never—" "It doesn't matter if they're true." Howard interrupted. "The narrative is set. Your reputation, everything you've built with the Grace Foundation, it's all at risk." Faith stood in the hallway, unseen, listening to their voices carry through the heavy door. Her heart cracked when Ethan didn't immediately defend her, when his response was silence and hesitation. That evening, while the house buzzed with crisis meetings, Faith quietly climbed the stairs to her room. With trembling hands, she began to pack her few belongings. The dress from the gala, her proudest creation, she left hanging in the closet. It belonged to a dream that was ending. Margaret found her as she was folding her mother's old Bible. "What do you think you're doing?" the elderly woman demanded, her voice sharp with concern. I have to go, Mrs. Sinclair. Faith whispered, tears threatening to fall. I won't bring shame to this family, to Ethan. Nonsense. This will blow over. Ethan will fix it. He shouldn't have to. Faith's voice was gentle but firm. The Grace Foundation is too important. Those women need help more than I need. She couldn't finish the sentence. Margaret reached for Faith's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. You're running away from love, child. That's never the answer. Sometimes love means protecting those you care about from harm. Faith kissed Margaret's cheek. You've been like a mother to me. I'll never forget that. In the pre-dawn hours, Faith moved through the silent house like a ghost. In Ethan's study, she placed a carefully written letter on his desk. The words had taken hours to write, each one carrying the weight of her heart. Dearest Ethan, thank you for showing me what it means to be truly seen. You gave me back my dignity when I'd forgotten I deserved it. The Grace Foundation will help so many women find their way back to hope. I won't let my presence tarnish that mission. Your mother needs you now more than ever. Please take care of her, and yourself. With eternal gratitude and love, Faith. She slipped out through the kitchen door just as the sky was beginning to lighten. The morning air was cold against her tear-stained cheeks as she walked past the gathered reporters, head held high despite their shouted questions and flashing cameras. At the train station, Faith bought a one-way ticket to Alabama. As she settled into her seat, watching the city skyline fade into the distance, she hummed her mother's old hymn softly. The same one that had once connected her to Ethan, now becoming a lullaby for her broken heart. Behind her, the morning news shows were already running with the scandal. Leonard Huxley appeared on screen after screen, playing the role of the concerned friend perfectly. I just hope Ethan sees the truth before it's too late, he said, his false sincerity masking the triumph in his eyes. But Faith didn't see any of it. Her phone remained off, tucked away in her bag. Instead, she pressed her forehead against the cool window glass, watching the landscape rush by, praying for strength to start over one more time. The train carried her south, away from the glittering world she'd briefly belonged to, back toward the simple town where she'd first learned to dream. In her bag, her sketchbook held new designs, dresses she'd probably never make now. But she held on to them anyway, these paper dreams, knowing that even if love hadn't lasted, she would always have the gift of creation God had given her. As the city disappeared completely behind her, Faith closed her eyes, exhausted from holding back tears. She remembered Ethan's words from just days ago. You taught me what grace looks like. Now she had to show him what dignity looked like, walking away with her head high, protecting what mattered most, even when it broke her heart to do so. The Alabama sun painted golden streaks across Faith's face as she stepped off the train. The familiar scent of magnolias and fresh-cut grass wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Her hometown of Cedar Grove hadn't changed much in 20 years. The same weathered buildings, the same rusty water tower, the same old church steeple reaching toward heaven. Mrs. Betty Johnson, her mother's oldest friend, met her at the station. The elderly woman's eyes were kind but worried as she gathered Faith into a tight hug. Child, when you called, I couldn't believe it. Welcome home. Faith managed a small smile. Thank you for helping me find the cottage, Mrs. Betty. It ain't much, Mrs. Betty said as they drove through quiet streets in her ancient Buick. But it's clean and peaceful, right next to Reverend Wilson's church, the same one where your mama used to sing in the choir. The cottage was indeed modest. Just 2 rooms with faded yellow walls and creaky floorboards. But the afternoon light streamed through lace curtains, and the small garden out back bloomed with wild roses. Faith set down her single suitcase and felt something inside her unknot slightly. Here she could breathe again. Over the next few weeks, Faith settled into a quiet rhythm. She cleaned the cottage from top to bottom, planted herbs in the garden, and spent long hours on the back porch with her sketchbook. The designs flowed easier here, away from the glitter and pressure of New York. One Sunday after church, Mrs. Betty mentioned that her granddaughter wanted to learn to sew. "She's got her heart set on making her own prom dress," she said. "Lord knows I can't thread a needle anymore with these old eyes." Faith's face brightened. "I could teach her," she offered. "I have my machine set up in the spare room." Word spread quickly in the small town. Soon Faith had 5 students, then 10. They gathered in her cottage 3 afternoons a week, the air filled with the whir of sewing machines and gentle laughter. Many of the women shared stories as they worked. Stories of hurt, of starting over, of finding strength they didn't know they had. "You're doing more than teaching sewing," Reverend Wilson told her one day. "You're healing hearts." The idea grew naturally from there. Faith started Stitches of Hope, a program combining sewing lessons with support groups for women who'd survived abuse. The local church offered space for larger gatherings, and a grant from a regional women's foundation provided supplies. "See how God works," Mrs. Betty said, watching Faith teach a young woman how to hem a skirt. "He brought you home to help others find their way." But at night, when the house was quiet, memories of New York would surface like waves. Faith would find herself remembering the way Ethan's eyes crinkled when he smiled, how his hand felt holding hers during their dance at the gala. She'd dream of Margaret's warm hugs and the peaceful gardens of the Sinclair estate. Sometimes, unable to sleep, she'd turn on her small TV and catch glimpses of news about Ethan. The reports weren't good. The scandal had scared away major investors. The Grace Foundation's funding had dried up. There were whispers of lawsuits and board members jumping ship. One particularly sleepless night, Faith pulled out her phone and looked up recent photos. Ethan looked tired, the light gone from his eyes as he pushed through crowds of reporters. Her heart ached to reach out, to tell him she was sorry for leaving so abruptly. But she knew she'd made the right choice. His world was too big, too complicated for someone like her. Meanwhile, in New York, Ethan Sinclair sat alone in his study, staring at Faith's letter. The paper had grown soft from handling, the ink slightly smudged where his fingers had traced her words again and again. His mother hadn't spoken to him for weeks after Faith left. "You let fear win," she'd said, "just like you did after Grace died." He'd thrown himself into damage control, trying to save his company. But nothing felt right anymore. The halls echoed with emptiness. Board meetings felt hollow. Even his success felt meaningless without Faith's quiet strength beside him. Leonard Huxley's smear campaign had done its work well. The press had painted Faith as a gold digger, a manipulator who'd worked her way into his life. But Ethan knew the truth. She was the most genuine person he'd ever met, someone who'd taught him that true wealth had nothing to do with money. Rain drummed against the windows as he read the letter one more time. "Thank you for showing me what it means to be truly seen," Faith had written. But she had it backward. She had been the one to truly see him, not as a billionaire or a powerful CEO, but as a broken man learning to hope again. Standing up suddenly, Ethan walked to his desk and opened his laptop. Within minutes, he'd booked a flight to Alabama. He didn't tell his assistant or his board members. For once in his life, he didn't care about protocols or appearances. As his driver took him to the airport, Ethan watched the city lights blur in the rain. He thought about Grace, about how she'd always told him to follow his heart. He hadn't listened then, too caught up in building his empire. But Faith had taught him that love was worth more than any fortune. The storm followed his plane south, but Ethan barely noticed. In his mind, he was already rehearsing what he would say to Faith. Not grand declarations or business proposals, but simple truths from a heart that had finally learned how to love again. He wasn't coming as Ethan Sinclair, the billionaire. That man had died the moment Faith walked away. He was coming as just Ethan, a man who'd found redemption in the grace of a woman strong enough to walk away from wealth to protect what mattered most. The plane descended through the clouds toward Alabama, carrying him closer to the only treasure that had ever truly mattered. The small Alabama town of Pine Grove hadn't changed much in the decades since Faith was a little girl. Ancient oaks still lined Main Street, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed in the warm breeze. The white-painted church still stood proudly at the corner, its red doors welcoming all who needed shelter. Inside the church hall that Wednesday afternoon, Faith stood among scattered fabric remnants and the gentle whirring of sewing machines. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. 8 women sat at the tables, each working on their own projects while sharing stories and quiet encouragement. "Miss Faith, could you help me with this seam?" called Sarah, a young mother of 3 who'd finally found the courage to leave her abusive husband. "I keep getting it crooked." Faith moved across the worn wooden floor, her flowered skirt swishing softly. "Remember what I told you. Slow and steady wins the race." She bent down beside Sarah, demonstrating the proper technique. "See how the fabric wants to guide itself? Just like life, sometimes we need to trust the path it's showing us." The other women nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in Faith's words. Each of them had come to stitches of hope, carrying heavy burdens, but here they found more than just sewing lessons. They found healing in the rhythm of needle and thread, in the simple act of creating beauty from broken pieces. "You're doing so much better," Faith encouraged, squeezing Sarah's shoulder. "Look how far you've come since—" The words died in her throat as a shadow fell across the doorway. The familiar silhouette made her heart stop, then race wildly. There stood Ethan Sinclair, but not the polished businessman she remembered from New York. This man looked tired, his expensive suit slightly rumpled, his face bearing the weight of sleepless nights. The room fell silent. The sewing machines stopped their humming. Faith's hands trembled as she straightened up, barely breathing. Ethan's eyes found hers across the sunlit space, and the world seemed to pause. Gone was the commanding presence of the billionaire CEO. Instead, there was something raw and vulnerable in his gaze, something that spoke of long nights and harder choices. "Faith," he said softly, his voice carrying in the hushed room. "Could we talk?" The women exchanged knowing looks. They'd heard pieces of Faith's story over the months, though she'd never mentioned names or specifics, but they recognized the weight of the moment. "Go on," Mrs. Betty whispered, patting Faith's hand. "We'll finish up here." Faith nodded, unable to speak. Her feet carried her across the floor as if in a dream. Ethan stepped back, holding the red door open for her. The familiar gesture, so gracious and gentle, made her heart ache. They walked in silence across the church lawn, where an ancient oak spread its protective branches. The same tree where Faith had played as a child, where she'd sought shelter during storms both literal and emotional. Now its shade welcomed them, offering a moment of privacy from curious eyes. Faith wrapped her arms around herself, though the afternoon was warm. "Why are you here, Ethan?" Instead of answering immediately, Ethan did something that took her breath away. He knelt in the dirt, not caring about his expensive suit or what anyone might think. The action was so unexpected, so unlike the proud man she'd known, that Faith took a step back. "I failed you," he said, his voice rough, with emotion. "When it mattered most, when you needed me to stand beside you, I hesitated. I was so afraid of losing my world, the company, the reputation, everything I'd built. He looked up at her, eyes shining with unshed tears. But I didn't realize I'd already lost my soul long before that, until you showed me what real grace looked like. Faith's heart thundered in her chest. Ethan, please stand up. You don't need to. Yes, I do. He reached for her hand, but stopped short of touching her. I've spent months trying to save my empire, watching it crumble anyway. But that's not what keeps me awake at night. What haunts me is the look in your eyes when you left, like you expected nothing better from me, like you were used to people choosing their comfort over your dignity. A tear slid down Faith's cheek. I forgave you long ago. She whispered. Why? The question seemed torn from his very soul. Because holding on to hurt only poisons the heart carrying it. I forgave you not for your sake, but for my own peace. Faith's voice grew stronger. The same way I forgave the Warrens, and everyone else who ever made me feel small. Forgiveness was my way of claiming my own worth. Something broke in Ethan then. His carefully maintained control crumbled, and tears began to fall. Slowly, reverently, he pressed his forehead against her hand. The touch was both a blessing and a plea, an acknowledgement of all that had been lost and all that might still be saved. Faith felt the wetness of his tears on her skin. This proud man, this titan of industry, was allowing himself to be completely vulnerable before her. No pretense, no power plays, just raw human need for connection and redemption. Around them, the oak's leaves rustled in the breeze. Birds called to each other in the branches above. Life continued its gentle rhythm, while two hearts finally found their freedom. One through the courage to ask forgiveness, the other through the grace to have already given it. For several moments they remained that way. Ethan kneeling in the Alabama dirt, Faith standing like an anchor in the storm. All the wealth and status that had once seemed to separate them disappeared, leaving only two souls learning to trust love again. Mrs. Betty watched from the church window, smiling softly as she whispered a prayer of thanksgiving. She'd seen many broken things mended in this place, clothes, hearts, lives. But watching Faith and Ethan under the old oak tree, she witnessed something even more precious, the healing of two souls who had forgotten how to dream until they found each other. The afternoon light softened around them, casting long shadows across the church lawn. In that gentle moment, both Faith and Ethan felt the weight of the past finally lifting, making space for whatever grace might bring next. The Alabama sun painted golden streaks across the shelter's linoleum floors as Ethan Sinclair, dressed in simple jeans and a white button-down shirt, pushed a mop across the dining room. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms unused to manual labor. Sweat dampened his collar, but his movements were careful, methodical, as if each stroke could wash away years of pride. From the kitchen doorway, Faith watched him work. She remembered countless hours spent cleaning other people's floors, how invisible she'd felt. Now here was a man worth billions, choosing to be visible in the humblest way possible. He's been at it for 3 hours straight, whispered Maria, one of the shelter residents. Never seen anything like it. Faith nodded, her heart full. Sometimes the strongest changes start with the smallest acts. Throughout the week, Ethan threw himself into every task, serving breakfast, washing mountains of dishes, fixing leaky faucets. The women at the shelter watched him with a mixture of curiosity and growing respect. Here was a man they'd seen in business magazines, now wearing an apron stained with dishwater, asking them about their stories, listening with genuine interest. On Wednesday afternoon, while drying plates beside Faith, Ethan broke their comfortable silence. I understand now. he said softly. What it means to serve instead of being served. Faith placed a bowl in the cabinet. It changes you, doesn't it? Everything about this place changes you. He gestured around the humble kitchen. The courage of these women, their resilience, the way they help each other heal. He set down his towel, turning to face her fully. Faith, what you've built here, it's extraordinary. But imagine what we could do together. She felt her pulse quicken. What do you mean? Your vision, my resources. We could expand this center, create a network of shelters across the country. Safe spaces where women can rebuild their lives, learn skills, find community. His eyes blazed with purpose. The Grace and Faith Foundation, combining both our stories into something bigger than ourselves. Faith's hands trembled as she dried another plate. Ethan, the last time we tried to do something public together. I know. He gently took the plate from her shaking hands. But I'm not the same man I was then, and you're not the same woman who felt she had to run away. Before Faith could respond, Reverend Harper appeared in the doorway. He'd been visiting the shelter regularly, offering counsel and prayer to the residents. His kind face held understanding as he looked between them. I couldn't help overhearing, he said. Faith, may I share something? She nodded, grateful for his steady presence. God doesn't hide blessings behind shame, he said simply. Sometimes what looks like our greatest vulnerability becomes our greatest strength. Your story, both your stories, could give hope to so many others. Faith closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. The Reverend had been there on that winter night when she'd nearly lost everything. He'd witnessed her rebirth. Now he was here, again, watching another kind of resurrection. That evening, after the dinner shift, Faith and Ethan sat at a small table in the shelter's garden. The air was sweet with jasmine, and crickets played their evening symphony. They'd spent hours drafting preliminary plans, funding structures, program outlines, expansion phases. But beneath the practical details lay deeper currents of possibility. It won't be easy, Faith said, looking over their notes. People will talk. They'll try to turn our story into something ugly again. Let them talk. Ethan's voice was firm. I'm not hiding anymore, and I won't let anyone shame what we're building. Faith studied his face in the fading light. The hard edges of the businessman had softened, replaced by something more genuine, more human. She saw traces of grief still there, but also hope, like spring pushing through winter soil. Faith, he said quietly, I know I have no right to ask this, but I need to know. He took a deep breath. Could you ever love me again? After everything? The question hung in the warm evening air. Faith thought of all the paths that had led them here, from marble hallways to humble shelter floors, from shame to dignity, from brokenness to healing. She thought of the lullaby that had first connected them, of grace that came full circle. I never stopped loving you, Ethan, she answered softly. But I had to learn to love myself first, to know my own worth before I could truly give my heart to anyone else. Tears glistened in his eyes. And now I know who I am. A woman made in God's image, worthy of respect, capable of both giving and receiving love. She reached across the table, taking his hand. And I see who you've become. A man who's learned that true wealth isn't in what you own, but in how you serve others. Around them, the shelter settled into its evening routine. Women's voices drifted from the common room, sharing stories and prayers. A child's laugh rang out somewhere inside. These were the sounds of healing, of life being rebuilt piece by piece. Faith looked at their joined hands, hers strong from years of work, his now calloused from days of service. Together they held the promise of something new, not just personal healing, but a chance to help others find their way from darkness to light. "So yes," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "I love you, not because of your money or status, but because you finally learned to kneel in the dirt and rise up changed." The evening deepened around them, wrapping them in its gentle peace. Through the shelter windows, they could see women gathering for the evening support group, their faces lit by hope. This was what grace looked like, not perfect, not pristine, but real and raw and transforming, just like their love. The Alabama spring painted the landscape in vibrant hues of green and gold. Wildflowers dotted the church lawn like scattered jewels. Daisies, black-eyed Susans, and purple coneflowers swaying in the gentle breeze. The small white church, a beacon of hope for generations, stood proudly against the azure sky. Inside, loving hands had transformed the humble sanctuary. Mason jars filled with wildflowers lined the wooden pews, their sweet fragrance mingling with the morning air. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the worn floorboards. In the bride's room, Faith stood before a mirror, hardly recognizing herself. Her wedding dress was a testament to redemption, crafted from hundreds of fabric scraps donated by the women she'd helped through the foundation. Each piece told a story of survival, stitched together with prayer and purpose. The bodice sparkled with tiny glass beads, while the full skirt flowed like a river of hope. She'd designed it herself, pouring all her dreams into every stitch. "You look absolutely radiant, my dear," Margaret Sinclair said, adjusting Faith's veil. The older woman's eyes glistened with tears of joy. Her own recovery had been remarkable. From bedridden to standing tall, her spirit as bright as ever. "I never thought I'd have a daughter to walk down the aisle." Faith turned to embrace her. "You've been more than a mother to me, Margaret. You saw me when I was invisible." A soft knock at the door announced Reverend Harper. "The choir's ready," he said, smiling warmly. "And Ethan, well, let's just say I've never seen a man more nervous or more sure about anything in his life." Faith's heart fluttered. Through the window she could hear the gospel choir warming up, their harmonies rising like prayers to heaven. The same lullaby that had once marked their deepest sorrows would now herald their greatest joy. Margaret squeezed Faith's hand. "Ready, my dear?" Faith nodded, her voice steady. "I've been ready since the moment God gave me a second chance at life." The church doors opened, and the choir's voices swelled. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The congregation rose as one. Faith and Margaret began their walk down the aisle, their steps measured and graceful. The women from the shelter, now more family than clients, beamed from the pews, some wiping away tears. Each had contributed a piece of fabric to Faith's dress, their stories woven into her new beginning. Ethan stood at the altar, tall and handsome in his dark suit. But it was the look in his eyes that took Faith's breath away. Gone was the haunted businessman who'd first walked into her cafe. In his place stood a man transformed by love and humility. Tears streamed freely down his face as he watched her approach. The wooden floors creaked softly under their feet as Margaret placed Faith's hand in Ethan's. The moment felt sacred, weighted with meaning beyond words. In the front pew, some of the shelter's children giggled and waved, making Faith's heart swell with even more love. The elderly pastor, who'd known Faith since she was a child, opened his worn Bible. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "We are gathered here today to witness not just a union of two hearts, but a testimony to God's unfailing grace." As the pastor spoke about love's redemptive power, Faith and Ethan couldn't take their eyes off each other. Every hardship, every tear, every moment of doubt had led them here. Their journey from employer and employee to equals in love stood as proof that God's plans were bigger than human prejudices. "The rings, please," the pastor called. A little girl from the shelter, wearing a dress Faith had made, stepped forward with the rings on a small white pillow. Each ring was inscribed with a single word: Grace. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto Faith's finger. "I, Ethan Sinclair, take you, Faith Daniels, to be my wife. I promise to love you with the humility I learned from your example, to cherish you with the strength you taught me to find, and to walk beside you in service to others for all our days." Faith's voice was clear and strong as she placed his ring. "I, Faith Daniels, take you, Ethan Sinclair, to be my husband. I promise to love you with the dignity God restored to me, to support you with the faith that saved me, and to build with you a legacy of hope for others." The choir softly hummed the lullaby that had first connected their hearts, its melody now transformed from a song of loss to one of celebration. "By the power vested in me," the pastor proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Before he could say another word, Faith looked up, her heart overflowing with gratitude. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, just loud enough for Ethan to hear, "for making all things new." The congregation erupted in applause and cheers. Women from the shelter threw flower petals, their faces shining with joy. Even the usually composed Reverend Harper wiped tears from his eyes as he watched the couple embrace. "That's what redemption looks like," he said to no one in particular, his voice thick with emotion. "Love strong enough to bridge any divide, grace deep enough to heal any wound." The gospel choir burst into joyous song as Faith and Ethan walked back down the aisle together. Sunlight poured through the windows, turning Faith's dress into a symphony of light, each piece of donated fabric catching the rays differently, creating a living testament to transformation. Margaret Sinclair stood proud and tall, watching her son and new daughter-in-law with tears of joy. The foundation's first branch, housed in a renovated building just down the street, stood as a promise to their community. Here, in this small Alabama town, love had written a new story of hope. Outside, the wildflowers danced in the spring breeze, nature's own celebration of two hearts made whole, two lives joined in purpose, and countless more lives touched by their shared mission of grace. Instead of jetting off to a luxury resort, Faith and Ethan chose a different path for their honeymoon. They loaded up their car with supplies, maps, and dreams, ready to touch lives across America. Their first stop was a women's shelter in Georgia, where Faith's story sparked hope in tear-filled eyes. "I was just like you," Faith shared, her voice gentle but strong, cleaning floors, feeling invisible, but God had bigger plans. The women leaned forward, drawn to her warmth and authenticity. Ethan stood quietly beside her, watching his wife's grace touch heart after heart. In Mississippi, they opened a new branch of the Grace and Faith Foundation in an old warehouse. The renovation transformed not just the building, but the neighborhood spirit. Local women learned sewing, business skills, and most importantly, their own worth. In Tennessee, a major news network caught wind of their journey. The producer was moved by their mission and invited them for a live interview. Faith sat in the makeup chair, breathing deeply, remembering all the women she'd met along the way. Their stories gave her courage. "Welcome back to Morning Light," the host began. "Today we have an extraordinary couple whose love story is changing lives across America." Under the bright studio lights, Faith spoke with quiet power. "I was fired without cause, accused of theft, and left in the cold. But that night wasn't my ending. It was my beginning." Her words reached into homes across the nation, touching hearts with their raw honesty. Ethan took her hand as he shared his part. "I was a man drowning in wealth but starving for meaning. Through losing my first wife and finding faith, I learned that true riches aren't in bank accounts, they're in acts of grace." Social media exploded with responses. Women from all walks of life shared their own stories of survival. The Foundation's website crashed from too many visitors wanting to help or seek help. After 3 weeks on the road, they returned home to Alabama. Faith had a surprise planned, a special dinner for the shelter residents who'd become family. The dining room glowed with candlelight as women filed in, their children running ahead with excitement. The aroma of home-cooked Southern food filled the air. Laughter echoed off the walls as stories were shared. One of the younger women started humming an old gospel tune, and soon the whole room joined in, voices rising in harmony. Faith stood, holding a basket of carefully wrapped packages. "Each of you has taught me something about strength," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She handed out small boxes containing dress tags she'd hand-stitched during quiet moments on their journey. The women gasped as they read the words. "You are more than your pain." Some clutched the tags to their hearts, others let tears fall freely. One elderly woman who'd survived 40 years of abuse whispered, "Nobody ever told me that before." Under the table, Ethan's hand found Faith's. "You gave me back my heart," he whispered, his voice just for her. Faith squeezed his hand, remembering their journey from that first meeting in the cafe to this moment of shared purpose. The evening wound down with more songs, more stories, more healing. Children fell asleep in their mothers' laps while plans were made for new programs, new opportunities, new beginnings. The room buzzed with hope, not the fragile kind, but the sturdy hope that comes from knowing you're not alone. As the last guests left, Faith and Ethan stood in the doorway, arms around each other. The Foundation's sign caught the moonlight, its words a promise to all who passed. Grace and faith, where new stories begin. Their honeymoon hadn't been about escape or luxury. Instead, it had been about multiplication, multiplying love, multiplying hope, multiplying chances for others to rise. Together, they had chosen to make their first chapter as husband and wife about lifting others up, just as they had been lifted. 10 years had passed like a gentle river, each day carrying new blessings downstream. Faith Daniels Sinclair stood at the entrance of St. Michael's Church, her hand resting on the weathered wooden door, the same door that had opened to save her life on that snowy night so long ago. "Can you believe it's been a decade?" she whispered, turning to look at Ethan beside her. His once dark hair had turned a distinguished silver, matching the winter sky above them. Laugh lines creased the corners of his eyes, evidence of years filled with joy rather than sorrow. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Ethan replied, squeezing her hand. "Other times it's like I've known you forever." They stepped inside the church together, the familiar scent of polished wood and burning candles wrapping around them like an old friend's embrace. The afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the worn floor. The same floor where Faith had collapsed that fateful night. The church choir was already assembled, their voices rising and falling in waves of harmony as they rehearsed for the Foundation's 10th anniversary celebration. Young women from all walks of life stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces glowing with purpose. Some were recent graduates from the Foundation's program, others were long-time success stories returning to give back. Faith paused in the center aisle, watching a young woman with close-cropped hair lead the soprano section. Just 6 months ago, that same woman had arrived at their shelter with nothing but a backpack and broken dreams. Now she stood tall, her voice soaring to the rafters. "Remember Maria?" Faith murmured to Ethan. "When she first came to us, she wouldn't even speak above a whisper." Ethan nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "Now look at her, teaching others to raise their voices." The choir director noticed them and smiled, but continued conducting. They were practicing the lullaby, the same song that had once echoed through both sorrow and joy in their lives. The melody wrapped around Faith's heart like a warm embrace. Faith found herself walking slowly toward the altar, memories flooding back with each step. Here was where Reverend Harper had found her. There was where she'd awakened in that field of light, hearing God's promise that she was made for more. Every inch of this sanctuary held pieces of her story. The foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams over the past decade. What started as a small shelter in Alabama had blossomed into a nationwide network of hope. Thousands of women had found their way to new beginnings through its doors. Each success story felt like a miracle, a testament to the power of love and second chances. Tears welled in Faith's eyes as she watched a group of younger women in the choir whispering and laughing between verses. Their joy was uninhibited, natural, the kind of freedom that comes from knowing you're truly safe and valued. "If God could turn my brokenness into this—" Faith's voice caught in her throat as she turned to Ethan. "There's hope for anyone." Ethan's eyes glistened in response. Without a word, he led her to the front pew. Together they knelt in prayer, their hands intertwined just as their lives had become. The choir's voices softened to a gentle hum, the lullaby floating around them like a blessing. Faith closed her eyes, remembering the woman she'd been, exhausted, afraid, scrubbing floors in the Warren penthouse. That woman could never have imagined this moment, could never have dreamed that her pain would become purpose, her shame would become strength. The candlelight flickered across their faces as they prayed, casting warm shadows that danced on the walls. In that gentle glow, Faith's face reflected not just peace, but triumph. This was more than just survival, it was resurrection. Every woman who found hope through their foundation was proof that love could indeed outshine the darkest nights. Around them, the choir's voices swelled with the final verse of the lullaby. Young and old, survivors and supporters, all joined in harmony. The sound filled every corner of the church, rising up to the heavens like incense. Faith opened her eyes and looked at her husband, seeing in his face the same wonder she felt. They had built something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. Their love story had become a beacon, showing others the way home to themselves. She was never the maid who was forgotten. She was the miracle that taught the world to believe again. The candles continued to flicker, casting their warm light over Faith and Ethan as they remained in prayer, their silhouettes merging into one shadow against the altar. Behind them, the choir's voices carried the ancient promise of hope, that even in our darkest moments, grace waits to light the way home. Around them, the church stood as it always had, a silent witness to countless stories of redemption. But perhaps none quite as powerful as the story of a maid who dared to dream again, and in doing so, helped thousands of others find their own path to dignity and love. The afternoon light continued to pour through the stained glass windows, painting Faith and Ethan in patterns of gold and rose, as if heaven itself was marking this moment. They remained there, hands clasped, hearts full, surrounded by the fruits of their shared mission, proof that love, once born from suffering, could indeed outshine even the darkest nights. Each note of the lullaby seemed to carry the whispered stories of every woman they'd helped over the past decade. Stories of courage, of renewal, of dreams reborn. And at the center of it all knelt Faith and Ethan, their love story a testament to the power of grace to transform lives. In this sacred space where her journey had begun 10 years ago, Faith felt the full circle of God's faithfulness. She wasn't just someone who had survived, she had become living proof that miracles still happened, that broken things could be made beautiful, that forgotten maids could become builders of dreams. The choir's voices gradually softened to a whisper, the lullaby ending as gently as a mother's good-night kiss. But the echoes of hope it carried would continue to resonate, touching lives far beyond these church walls for generations to come. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.